Hello there. As you've probably guessed, due to the current uncertainties, I'm currently in the UK, wishing I could be there with you. I hope that will be possible in the near future, and I can connect with you and share good times together. To begin with, I wish to offer my heartfelt thanks to the National Hangul Museum and the World Congress of Korean Language for inviting me to present this talk. In particular, I would like to thank Ahn Sang-soo and Ahn Byun-hak for recommending and supporting me. It's an extraordinary and humbling honour to be asked to give this keynote speech, especially as being the only non-Korean to be invited. I believe this reflects my deep connection to Korea over many years through working with many Korean businesses and being frequently involved in education and culture there. I have many dear friends in Korea and have always been enchanted by Korea's warm culture and people. I've long been involved in graphic design, both as a practitioner at the Brody Associates Studio and as an educator at the Royal College of Art. Graphic design itself is a form of language, a living, fluid, visual encoding of cultural ideas, relationships and possibilities. I've always been drawn to its power to transform and question, a process more vital now than at almost any other point. I work with a core agile design team based here at the London studio, which operates globally with a wide network of dedicated creatives, associates who bring specific additional skills and experience on a project-by-project basis. We fluctuate from highly creative exploratory projects to ones that are much more focused on communication strategies and system building. Our main focus is on creative direction, typeface design and identity, which brings us into constant contact with collaborators and clients throughout the world, particularly here in Korea. What I think I can bring to this conference is an outsider viewpoint of the global context critical for the understanding and discussion of any language. The ever-changing world we live in is having a major impact on its natural, authentic and indigenous cultures and languages, the value and necessity of which we can neither underestimate nor ignore if we are to continue to live or even survive in a rich, sophisticated and living world. Neither am I a qualified linguist, but as a designer in visual communication, I'm constantly navigating and negotiating the way we view and interact with the world. What I've come to understand through this is that by its very nature, language is political and consequently open to a positive as well as a negative influence on our lives. I believe our languages and cultures are living entities and must be dynamic and evolutionary, not fixed, adapting and initiating appropriate change and new ideas to countenance the increasing prevalence of globalized control mechanisms. King Sejong fully understood this. By developing the language mechanism of Hangul as a response to the elite and exclusive use of Hanja, he created a more democratic and accessible means to share literature, commerce, culture, identity and even power. Consequently, more than in most language scripts, we can trace in the development of Hangul a living embodiment and depiction of Korean history and cultural lineage. We are all essentially indigenous beings, having evolved our legacies and heritage through tribal and social independence as communities, at root the result of nomadic exploration and isolation. For the purposes of this discussion, we need to posit an idea of what is an indigenous culture or language. Alongside conventionally understood categories such as artistic and spiritual expression, culture can be stated as the social behaviour, social structure and fundamental beliefs of any society, which then act as lenses through which they perceive the world and through which, in turn, they are perceived. Culture is not the collection and curation of physical artefacts. It is to be found in the being of a culture, in how that culture is lived, and how artefacts are in fact intrinsically connected to their social and societal functions as utilities. An authentic or indigenous language is by its very nature a relevant and a living one, evolving, adapting, serving, and acting not only as a tool, but as a dedicated vessel for communal history and identity. This cultural description is not only true of civilizations as defined through geographic location or religious belief, but, as a consequence of the ubiquitous presence of technology, can no longer be described in terms of physical boundaries. A 23-year-old today will likely inhabit an interest community which is more a part of a global, non-sovereign world hewn out of social media, video games and brand messaging. In this space, we seem to be moving relentlessly at an accelerated pace towards a global monoculture, a kind of homogeneous existence where the majority of differentiated identities are melded together into one homogenized single culture society. As such, we are all experiencing existential challenges that are hiding in plain view, ones that will significantly impact the way we live in terms of our identity, power and possibility, and in ways that will increasingly disrupt, redefine or deplete the meaning we hold as individual beings. We are living in an age that can be defined as one of condensation, the condensing of cultures, peoples, industries, finance, ownership, politics and identity, which are all consequently gathered as if they were commodities into distinct blobs or batches. This constant scaling up of what a unit entails delivers and supports an increasingly unequal ownership model, one where the flow of influence, control and benefit is concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. This model can be thought of as one akin to the process of entropy, where sophistication and individuality give way to a uniform and clustered disorder, where a real sense of uniqueness is dissipated. This can be best seen in the relentless charge of globalization, where any complexity is treated as a glitch, not a quality. And localized cultures are reduced to manageable sets of codes, where languages are treated as forms of DNA for sequencing and splicing. Most brands today fundamentally believe they need to be limited in their cultural lexicon in order to successfully and efficiently distribute their services, products and ideologies as widely as possible. A complicated model is neither an effective nor efficient form of manufacturing or distribution. In this case, local complexity and the elements that render it authentic are frequently assimilated, eliminated and replaced with a homogenized menu of choices. In the need to distribute produce to ever larger markets, audiences are mainly treated as one. To do otherwise is seen as challenging economically and difficult to resource, requiring willpower and an army of cultural guardians. As the growth and sophistication of technology, global platforms and mass brands enable the extension of communication outwards and inwards, reaching every part of the known world and beyond, this process of entropy increasingly takes hold and complexity procedurally dissolves into its smallest component parts. The impact of this process is inevitably one of simplification and standardization, in which complexity, difference or opposition are flattened out to their lowest common denominator. A homogenization that distills out unevenness and creates an average or mediocre world in which small, frequently insignificant differences become paramount. This sifting and batching ultimately leads to a state of universal dichotomy, a diametrically polarized world. We can vividly see the outcome of these tendencies in the politics of today. As the nature of our social communication platforms becomes less complex and the user audience increases, the consequence is more and more one of dualistic opposition. Currently increasing levels of populism directly parallel these decreasing levels of complexity. The hashtag, meme, emoji or phrase takes hold. Make America Great Again, Brexit, hashtag #MeToo, Black Lives Matter, BTS. These are all highly effective organizational mechanisms. The danger here is in the reductive focus of these symbols, in that any nuance, questioning or doubt is rarely tolerated and a polarized outcome is inevitable. For or against, black and white, you versus me. In this world of oversimplified messaging and shallow difference, civil war itself becomes a real possibility. The danger here is that difference, diversity, nuance or questioning are no longer deemed acceptable. Expertise or true risk-taking creativity are largely untrusted and viewed as dangerous, and formulated entertainment then fills the space with comfort and a false sense of ease and security. In some cases, however, this process of simplification can be consciously turned to positive effect. The one campaign was centered around the international campaign to make poverty history. In this case, the creation of a reductive, simplified identity was highly intentional. By consciously flipping the usual process of condensation for a good cause, it provided a rallying call that stated that we're all in this together and that every human being counts. It became the most successful lobbying campaign in North America, attracting over 3 million signatures. Similarly, in this world, countercultures have a highly significant role to play. Identity politics, diversity and inclusion are a social necessity born out of the response to the homogenization of populist culture, where frequently the celebration of the items that stand out on our social media platforms ironically thrive on the consensus and the elimination of difference. Authentic identity and truth in this space have always been treated as luxuries and as controlled commodities. We need to reclaim them. True street culture was always viewed as a threat. Now, codified absorption of these cultures, in fact of any indigenous languages or cultures, has become a well-rehearsed formula that feeds successful commercial or political interests with artificial authenticity. Mirror images are difficult to challenge or even recognize as such, and ultimately they replace the very cultures that they hijack, which are now converted into cliches and stereotypes. Supreme is the New York skate and streetwear brand. Conversely, they understand street culture implicitly and have tapped into the current sense of the need for radical responses and calls to social action. For this collection, they worked with us to amplify a sense of typography and messaging last witnessed in the 80s, but highly pertinent in our current climate. Voices which resurface throughout history and at times of political oppression and a sense of not being listened to. Punk itself is an example of a distinct cultural community with an independent language that unites a set of beliefs and intentions. Similar in feel to previous protest communities like Dadaism or San Francisco in 1968, punk was seen as a threat to society in general and identified by the way it delivered its attitudes through its messages, through fanzines, fashion, music, and graffiti. Punk's language was built on a desire to destroy in order to build back differently, the desperate call of a disenfranchised youth, perceived as a threat to the very fabric of society. In the end, key parts of its language were turned into symbols and cliches and assimilated into advertising in wider society, rendering the dangerous and unfamiliar as something safe and labelled. Everything we see or do as living beings is subject to a form of language. By embodying and organising the encoding of signs, it frames, it enables, and it determines our interactions and our understandings of the world, and consequently, our ability to navigate and negotiate it. A language is essentially a contract between any number of parties or entities. At its most basic level, we agree that a limited set of identifiable components or building blocks, when assembled in a certain order, deliver a particular meaning. The resultant script or alphabet, with its ensuing lexicon and syntax, acts as a kind of glue that both enables and fixes our communities. As an authentic living mechanism, it effectively evolves from and creates a fluid, codified version of our very being. In doing so, language can be seen as essentially transactional, that it acts as an interface between parties to enable transactions of instructions, of emotions, of relationships, of values, of data, and of ideas. It also enables a form of maintenance in that it embodies and acts as a repository or guardian for cultures, philosophies, values and belief systems. We identify and recognize ourselves through our cultures as encoded in our languages. If existence is at root information, and we perceive that information through these signs and symbols, then the mechanisms that we use to capture, convey and communicate that information have an intrinsic and significant impact on our perceptions. Information in itself is not, in fact, but is the way that we're informed about a fact. Language converts intangible ideas and phenomena into tangible objects. This process of translation inevitably influences the interpretation of the actual object or concept being communicated. Therefore, our languages in their various multimodal forms, be that visual or iconic, written, spoken or behavioural, inevitably control and manipulate how we should receive and understand these embedded ideas. All human communication is in fact rhetorical, with its phrasing, structure and intonation. How you tell a story becomes the story and is inseparable from it. As we are fundamentally controlled and conditioned by our languages, they become susceptible not only to manipulation, but through an editing process due to the perceived need for efficiency and streamlining, to a form of censorship. This means that any individual idea can both be framed and restricted by the very languages used for it to be distributed or shared. Language in this sense can be seen as a framework and mechanism that enables the sharing of thoughts and can simultaneously be viewed as a limitation that potentially controls our thinking and culture. However, as we've seen already, with good intent, language development can also be utilised as a constructive strategy and can catalyse positive shifts in society. The invention and consequent dissemination of Hangul intentionally brought literacy and enablement to the masses, as did the shift from Latin to English in Britain, helping to level the elite and to democratise culture and commerce. Similarly, accessibility languages like sign language or road signs are tailored specifically for positive purposes. Languages can also be seen as a device that can extend our cultures and creative possibilities. I'm highly interested in the exploration of ideas beyond conventional languages. By inventing new forms and building blocks of language that can be combined in different ways to create new meanings, we can begin to release the invisible limitations we can experience through our dependence on traditional languages, and to realise new thoughts, possibilities or experiences. With Fuse, the experimental typography laboratory and magazine we launched in 1990, we invited different designers to explore what the invention of new alphabets could bring to the expansion of our means of expression by exploring the boundaries of the fixed languages we currently live with. While some contributors worked with new forms and shapes, like this poster for FS State, some contributors worked with limited character sets, in this case by Gerard Unger, who decided that 10 shapes only would allow him much more flexibility to produce something both legible and free enough to be recombined into something highly expressive or other. In this font, the designers were pushing beyond form itself, looking at texture as the basis for a set of language codes. For Fuse 10, we focused on the idea of creating entirely abstracted forms of written language, based on the premise of a variable set of related components or building blocks, which we call freeform typography. In this way, we approached something closer to the experience of music or painting, and that we were exploring the power of typographic design to communicate something beyond the actual text being conveyed. Finally, in this poster by Jason Bailey, we see a font which to us appears more as a scrawl. It is, in fact, his mother's best attempt at writing. She was suffering from multiple sclerosis at the time and wanted to reveal to the world, through her best attempts at writing, what the actual experience of her condition was like. The photograph behind is of her as a 16-year-old, just before she started experiencing the illness. What Fuse did was to explore and reveal how our languages and the way they are designed or presented can act as symbols for schools of thought, experience or belief. In fact, our civilizations are fundamentally based on signs and symbols, mechanisms or instruments that convey knowledge. By enabling our understanding of the world, they form the basis and origins of our languages. Ultimately, a symbol is both a codified object and an instruction of a particular action, belief, confirmation, idea, thought or reaction. As such, it also possesses a value and is therefore transactional or ownable, imbuing power. Consequently, as repositories for social culture, languages themselves become collective symbols for identity and our reference for authenticity, a mode which is also exposed to the potential process of mass simplification or condensation. We see this evidenced in our now technology-driven universal lexicon of simplified images, symbols and icons, ones that we now can all understand and relate to, and yet have no tangible provenance, as witnessed in the increasingly generic languages and codes of our urban spaces and digital non-realities. In the increasingly ubiquitous environment brought about by technology, from print to radio to digital, brands and public institutions increasingly utilize what are called condensation symbols. That is, a single symbol that can represent multiple emotions, ideas, feelings, memories, or impulses. This is compounded by increased reach, as our visible world embraces more and more cultures and peoples at every single moment in time. In brand culture, this can take the form of the cross-cultural instrument of the brand logo or mark. It could be a phrase like, "just do it," or "I'm loving it." Or it could be through the more covert form of assimilated stereotypes and cultural symbols, like street culture, or indigenous or tribal culture, pop icons, fashion, or music. Interestingly and challengingly, as a graphic designer, I am often placed at the heart of this process. By definition, making something graphic or clear, you make it tangible, understandable, and manageable. But you also make it potentially easier to assimilate. Therefore, identification can be seen as a form of exposure, a process whereby something which was intangible is converted into something which is potentially tradable. Once done, these objectified symbols can be isolated and then swapped out for new, more global and artificial ones, part of a process of global culturalization. This is the challenge for authentic or indigenous cultures, that by being perceived through their icons, signs, symbols and languages, they can be more easily assimilated, and doing so can become neutralized and effectively rendered inert. This displacement of local cultures by global interests potentially dissolves local heritage and identity into generic copies. And this is the danger posed by globalization and multinational corporations. Strategically, the only counter solutions or tactics are ones of either invisibility, respectful appreciation, or constant evolution. The response has to be one of either ambiguity, in which the audience is an equal part of the dialogue and where the definition is not fixed, or by respect, where the brand adapts to the culture, not the other way around. Some entities have taken a more sensitive approach to the challenge of how to grow globally while respecting local cultures where possible. Samsung, like many entities or societies, had evolved into a number of different divisions and activities as it grew, each with its own visual dialect or language. The only thing holding the group together was a sovereign identity based on its name and logotype, or flag. Our role was to bring together all of their different touch points across different product lines, activities, experiences and territories into a cohesive whole by creating a standardized type and icon language. The universal icon language was key, as this allowed a sharing of coherent information, instructions and warnings across any activity. We established a common basis and engineering approach for the construction of each symbol. The typeface was more of a challenge. The brief was to create something highly functional and scalable, yet retain a level of unique and recognizable personality when viewed at a large size. We started by establishing the Latin version of the font across a large number of weights and styles, and then filtered out and identified what was the core DNA essence of the font. The approach we took was not to impose a Latin version on any other language, but instead to work with specialists in those local scripts to create localized fonts which were authentic and familiar, yet shared some of the core DNA. In this way, we reversed the usual process of assimilation and instead created a harmonized cultural space for Samsung that had no language locus, one in which different scripts could exist harmoniously together within the same space. Brands today are primarily manufacturers of communication, with everything else following in its wake. Through marketing, UX design and AI, the experience is now largely predefined for the user and not left to chance. The user journey is designed and controlled and no longer truly serendipitous. Apparent user choice here is actually a deception. We're allowed to choose from previously determined selections that have already been well market researched and optimized. Content is king, and the constant search for original or unique material is all-consuming. Brands are now defined by the stories they tell, and more significantly for us, the rhetoric of how they tell their stories. The language, tone of voice, typeface, approach to imagery, colour choice and narratives that brands employ become their definition and identity. As these brands increasingly manufacture stories, not objects, how they tell their stories defines and models our connection to them. Social media is itself reductive and simplifying, converting all complexity into bite-sized messages and memes, easy to distribute or swipe. The reward path that elevates views, likes and followers above difference or difficulty is leading to a dumbing down and desophistication of our cultures. In this flattened space, deeper meaning slowly disappears and small, shallow variations gain maximum importance. A slightly different colour, a different font, a different singing of the same song. Not real diversity, just diversion. The increase in speed and connectivity enabled by technological development and widening access has also had a diminishing effect on cultural endurance and longevity. As images become more iconic and attention-seeking, and ideas become increasingly transient and transitional, swiping to nowhere except more images, words are now only recognised, not read, and the read more link is rarely clicked. This always heightened and never satisfied excitement of on-screen media means that yesterday's trending stories are quickly forgotten as they scroll off-screen and are replaced by today's dramas. In the swirling sea of constant attention, sharp peaks are always followed by shallow deficits. Ideas are rarely given the time required to fully gestate and to be nurtured. The lifetime of a thought or deeper question is increasingly shortened by the impatience of our rapidly diminishing attention spans. We live in an environment which is less and less capable of dealing with difficulty or with complex narratives and experiences. As I noted earlier, graphic designers are translators of invisible concepts into tangible objects, and as such have a position of social responsibility. In my studio, we are constantly aware of this and the potentially conflicting position that we hold. Fundamentally, we choose to design and build sophisticated language systems for our clients and other entities, intentionally rich and complex, human, inclusive and engaging, with a built-in capacity to evolve and adapt. We don't seek to oversimplify these language systems, but instead aim to make them feel more organic by internal alignment so that they become hopefully more relatable, understandable and fluid. We focus on three core areas of activity within the development of identity and visual languages: structure, building blocks, and then possibility. Akin to architectural processes, our approach to system building is based on a clear design roadmap. We start always with a period of deep research in which we determine the context, background culture, and intention for each project, directly followed by the identifying of a relevant strategy, in which we locate the appropriate approach and form. A period of ideation, where we creatively interpret the research to make the strategy tangible, precedes the actual system building, which lays the framework and structure for the actual language. And finally, a moment for expression, in which we bring the framework to life through dynamic interpretation. As well as establishing the core system and framework, we strongly emphasize the details of the key elements contained within that system. Every visual design system speaks as a language, and in doing so places a great deal of emphasis on the way it is spoken. This means developing a toolbox of parts, including colour, shape, icon, and typeface. The typeface itself is key, as it not only has to function as a mechanism for distributing messaging and instructions, but also conveys the personality of the speaker and the tone of the message. The choice of font dictates how we interpret any message. A sentence set in Helvetica will be perceived very differently if it is again set in Times Roman Italic or Cooper Black. With British television broadcaster Channel 4, we worked closely with them on developing a typeface that was not only unique and memorable, but also had to carry a number of clear personality traits and philosophies that the channel held. This included a notion of creative and alternative political independence, a position that willfully challenged expectations and norms, championing and supporting the social outsider. One of the most important creative spaces for me is around expression. Once we have built a language system and determined the core building blocks and structure, we can then express this language creatively. Like jazz, where we need to primarily establish a framework around chord structure, rhythm, and the instruments being played, we can then freely improvise and bring the space to life, always knowingly in reference to its structural context and the form's cultural history and audience. In order to engage the audience and to position creative communication as a two-way process, not a monologue, we need to be open, not fixed, fluid, not predetermined. This means embracing a degree of ambiguity, abstraction, and unfinishedness. In this relationship, the viewer or user is completing the creative process, bringing an inclusive and unmediated response, not one that is dictated. Placed on a building in a former factory complex in central Beijing, industrial typography and urban shapes crash together against a vivid and contemporary orange background. Commissioned by Converse and entitled Vortext, it explores the jaggedness of our daily communication spaces by placing it in the middle of an urban environment. For Masha Ma, the innovative Chinese fashion designer, we created a set of shapes based on abstracted sections of the human body in the form of a typeface that then provided the basis for a fashion collection. We often consider our expressive work as related to a kind of visual poetry, with a dynamic design and layout of the words themselves can bring other meanings, often fluid and open to interpretation. With the magazine Arena En Plus, we explored the power of type and image as a way to extend the editorial narrative into something more challenging and unexpected. Column widths were set too narrow for the headlines, which meant they would run around and create unexpected word fragments and arrangements. Type and image were also treated as pieces of sculpture. Shapes in themselves would bring an additional layer of meaning and possibility. As I stated earlier, nature, life, needs complexity to survive. The danger that eliminating difference and creative risk exposes us to is potentially one of extinction. Unlimited variation and the free process of natural selection are vital to natural adaptation and continuity. In our societies, the loss of cultural fauna suggests a global culture at the edge of crisis through the narrowing of its own spectrum of variables. In this diminishing world, this flat earth, difference, complexity, and individuality become absolutely vital and invaluable. The recognition and protection of existing indigenous cultures and languages becomes critically necessary, as does the need to constantly explore and develop new ones, no matter at what scale. Homogenization destroys independent culture, and standardization catalyzes the end of natural selection and evolution. We can do something to counter many of the issues that this talk raises. It will take awareness and creativity. We need to maintain constant vigilance, consciousness, awareness, and the continual embracing of questioning, experimentation, exploration, and creative risk-taking. Difficult conversations have to happen, culturally, ideologically, and creatively. We need to protect and nurture our languages and cultures, not by freezing or preserving them, but by embracing them and allowing an evolutionary response. We can take the best of technological advancement and adapt it to our needs, not the other way around. Education also plays a vital part of how we respond. We need to encourage our students in all disciplines and at all ages to embrace risk-taking and exploration, and to think and act beyond the confines of the curriculum. The purpose of education is to ensure the future is a better place than the present, empowering our students to challenge the status quo and know the right questions to ask without fear is paramount to this. At the RCA, we have designed our courses to encourage processes of transformation and innovation. Without changing minds, we can't change cultures. This mantra is one we need to embed at all stages and forms of education. Like an archaeological reading of sediment or the rings of a tree, Hangul has always remained a living record of Korea's evolving history and continues to do so, rich in embodied culture and identity. This Congress evidences that, as a vital fulcrum for investigating changes in identity, culture and ideology, and through this process, bigger questions can be asked and debated about our future, our hopes for continued existence within it, and what that future might look like. Creative risk and exploration are constantly and continually needed, essential to a deep function of questioning, challenging and extending our worlds in order to prevent stagnation, manipulation and entropy. It can also be the root of joy and a sense of freedom, an aliveness grounded in unrestricted creativity and imagination. True authenticity is dangerous. It doesn't always align with our expectations. It isn't predictable or controllable. We might not like it. It isn't perfect and it isn't always comforting. Diversity is exactly that, diverse. We need to include all voices and possibilities, to speak together, not at each other. Let our communication systems respond organically, not through surveillance, analysis and calculation. Authenticity is the vital prerequisite for both survival and for the quality of our lives. To create, you have to destroy. To imagine something new, you have to be conscious of what came before. Here's to the possible. Thank you for listening.